This panel is titled The Sharing Economy, Scaling the Shared Use Mobility Marketplace. And we have a really fun panel here. I think Lisa's gonna probably be her usual self, provocative, exciting. And here she comes. Exciting. We'll try if you can. So Lisa's gonna serve as our moderator. And I am gonna let her introduce her speakers. But one of the things Lisa and I were just chatting about is we'd love to have some more time for audience participation in this next panel. So Lisa is possibly going to ask speakers to maybe keep their comments a little bit brief so that we can get through some of these topics and have more questions from the audience. And so with that, I will turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Susan. Well, we're delighted to be here. We're hoping to be feisty rather, and engage you all. I think that from our perspective, the opportunity for sharing is essentially looking at ways that we can share between cities, between systems, biases. Certainly there's this kind of mushing together between private and public, that there's real opportunities to learn and to rethink and reinvent. And so I'm delighted to be here because you all are here. And a lot of why I think we're interested in kicking off this conversation is to start a discussion over the next day and a half together. We're looking at the intersection of the sharing economy, where access trumps ownership often, and where we're able to access goods, services, and talent as a way to, as kind of the intersection with shared use mobility and many of these platforms that you're very familiar with and working on in various parts of the world. And so I'm delighted to introduce you to the panelists. We have Alain here, Ayotte, who is a bike sharing specialist from Montreal. Rick Hutchinson, who has a deep expertise in car sharing and works with City CarShare, as well as CarShare Association, is that right? Natalie Foster, who's a co-founder and CEO of a new organization in the sharing economy called peers.org. And then Gabe Klein from the city of Chicago, who tells me that if you just say Gabe, everybody knows.
No, I didn't say that.
Apparently, he's been trouble in other conferences. So I would just like to kick off the conversation, because as we look at what it is what we're about to talk about together, I would just like each of the panelists to give a brief intro so you have a sense of what their point of view is, and then we'll dive into some discussion together. Alain?
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on the summit. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm passionate about urban mobility, bike sharing in particular. I'm a former CEO of PBSC, which is a company who provides Bixi to cities around the world. We went a long way in bike sharing since the white bike of Amsterdam in the 60s. And I want to raise my hat to the pioneer of the third generation system, Mr. Vesco, that just spoke before us. That were really pioneer in Lyon with bike sharing. And we learned from them. And that's what we need to do. We need to learn from the past and learn from our mistake and move on and grow and offer a better service to the community. Times are changing. We are experiencing a huge paradigm shift in cities right now. People are more about experience than ownership. I think some panelists mentioned that a lot, and you will hear that a lot in the next few days. And bike sharing is part of that big movement where experience is more important than ownership. Bike sharing is not about bicycle and about cycling culture. Bike sharing is about urban mobility. And urban public transport. A bike sharing system should be integral part of the public transportation and should be considered as is. People want to have a good experience, want to have opportunity to have a door-to-door service. People are connected all the time online. They can access all information. We need to share information and make sure we mesh all modes of transportation together, and bike sharing is an integral part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Short enough?
Yes, that was perfect. Good. I didn't even have to slap you, right?
I was worried.
No, you were good. I threatened him, you know, so I'm so threatening. Rick, please.
So I represent City CarShare. City CarShare is a 12-year-old nonprofit car-sharing organization. We are, at this point, the largest nonprofit car-sharing organization in North America. We are a proud founder and member of the Car Sharing Association, and we get to talk about the importance of that group at some point, too. The perspective that we take in looking at car sharing is that is less in coming from a nonprofit perspective, but more from a mission-based and a value perspective. We believe very strongly that car sharing, its purpose and its design, is to help local communities meet their environmental and social goals. So what works in Buffalo, New York doesn't necessarily work in Ithaca, New York. What works in Austin, Texas doesn't necessarily work in San Francisco. So we have to look at all these modes of vehicle sharing, of car sharing, of ride sharing, of shuttle services, all of them as part of an ecosystem. We believe very strongly that if communities lose track of what the purpose is of transit and transportation models and services, that they are going to find problems down the road, that they are going to lack the ability to turn it around and truly find those environmental and social benefits that they desire. We think that there's a couple of challenges that are in place right now. There are many challenges, but I'm going to highlight 3 of them. The first one is that innovation gets ahead of policy. And you heard about that earlier today from Director Reskin and some others. Really important thing for us to tackle. The number 2 thing is there's a need for dollars and capital. You're seeing in car sharing now lots of OEMs, car manufacturers, all of the major rental car agencies have come in and with big dollars because there is something happening here with shared mobility that they now know they need to get a hold of. So they're bringing some of this, but where do they put that capital? Where do they put that money is going to be very important. And finally, we need to focus part of this session is about scaling, but I think we need to focus not just on scale and market share, but on what's the purpose of that scale and that market share. We need to be able to look at environmental impacts, reduction of congestion. The key factor here is that there isn't one mobility model you're going to hear about here in this conference that doesn't require use of the public good, of the public right of way. And that changes the equation in our view.
Okay, Rick, thank you so much. And Natalie.
My name is Natalie Foster. I, along with several colleagues, just launched an organization called Peers. You can find us at peers.org. And we represent tens of thousands of people who share their homes, their skills, their time, their money, and their cars and other forms of transportation. All around the globe, we believe that sharing and the peer economy could be the defining economic force for the 21st century. And that it's a movement of people who are building this economy city by city all over the world. Do we have any founding Peers members here? Yeah, a few of you, a few hands. So good to see you. The rest of you should join. Our members are really, really excited about the transportation piece. It's just one aspect of the sharing economy, but it's one of the most vibrant. We see our members all over the world certainly have been part of carpooling for a while and are excited about the way technology is changing and scaling carpooling. They're excited about peer-to-peer ride sharing and car sharing. They are excited about sharing bicycles, shared scooters here in San Francisco, and a whole set of other things. They're on all sides of the marketplace. In some cases, they're sharing the cars that they own and sharing them with neighbors through models like Get Around and Relay Rides. And in other cases, they're using their smartphone to hop into a Lyft or a sidecar, which is, a car driven by a peer who comes and picks you up. In many cases, they're actually the drivers on these new services. So we're just in a really interesting moment where technology is taking this this space and really allowing for all kinds of new participation, new entrepreneurship, and new ways of thinking about getting around the city. So Peer's role is to tell the story of the sharing economy, to help it grow, and also to advocate for it. So a lot of what we do is put the tools into the hands of the people who are using the sharing economy. So as these conversations are happening city by city, we can help move it forward, help figure out how do we regulate this brave new world.
Thank you very much. And Gabe,
All right. Gabe Klein.
just in case anyone.
So about me, I've spent about the last 20 years working in, I don't know exactly what to call it, sort of the urban space, alternative transportation, mostly in the private sector, actually. About 15 years in the private sector, and the last 5 or so in the public sector. So I worked in the bike business as a kid growing up, and then for the largest bike retailer, and then in technology, and then Robin Chase, I was telling Lisa, hired me at Zipcar in the early days. I was there for 4 years, and I started my own electric vehicle vending truck sort of manufacturing company, and then we actually operated street food trucks, which, wow, that was a crazy business. And then got drafted to run the DC DOT as sort of an unconventional candidate, and then for Adrian Fenty, who may drop by here today, actually. And Rahm Emanuel then, when Adrian lost, had me come out to Chicago. So the reason I'm going into all that is that I think that I do have a bit of a unique perspective, because I sort of understand how the nonprofit car share company feels versus the traditional car share company versus the government agency who's trying to regulate this and figure out what to do with the public space, which is really crucial in cities. You know, when you think about the public space and the re-urbanization of cities, you've got this density happening, which is what we used to have 100 years ago, right? And so 100 years ago, everybody rode around in the streetcar. One woman would take care of 6 people's kids in the very populated tenements. I mean, sharing was just sort of part of the way things were. And so really all we're doing is going back to what we once were, but layering on technology, which makes it much different. So as Dan from DC said, you know, we pushed really hard in the 2 years I was there to bring, you know, a sort of scaled bike share to continue to innovate with car sharing and allow Car2Go to operate and things of that nature. And then, you know, now that I'm in Chicago, we're struggling with, like, how do you regulate TNCs or, you know, real-time rideshare companies and all of that. And our thing is sort of, well, just don't get overly involved. So anyway, I look forward to the conversation. It should be interesting.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So you can see now why I'm excited to hang out with these guys. I think that one of the main themes here is, well, if we're all so keen on sharing, why aren't we doing more of it? And, you know, how do we make this go a bit faster? How do we learn more from each other? And how do we see more or take advantage of the opportunities? Rick mentioned the ecosystem between feet and street, you know, between walking and biking and taxis and public transit and all these different modes of transportation. But we also know that there's been a lot of, at least informal sharing between cities in terms of things that have data, like bike sharing systems, and many of the apps as a sort of collateral goodness is the data that comes out of them. But there's an opportunity to more broadly use the data and expand peripheral vision for everyone. So let me ask back to you all, you know, what are the challenges to keep us from sharing more profusely and more broadly? And what would we need to do to actually open this up and collaborate more?
Can I start? So there's 2 things. First, you mentioned it earlier, the data sharing. I think we need to open our books and open our data to everybody, so we can get we can learn from the numbers. But also another way of sharing knowledge, it's share best practices. Why reinventing the wheel all the time? No, the planet is a big village now. We can have the technology allow us to know what instantly, what's happening anywhere in the world. So why can we don't have access to best practice from everywhere around the world? And it's summit like this one and sharing knowledge all together and meet all together that will allow that, on top of sharing, have an open data system.
Okay, that makes sense. And just to jump to Gabe, do you have a point of view from a government perspective where, is Chicago keen on just sharing data liberally? What data do you expect back from people who are collaborating with you, and what would you do differently now that you've tried a couple of experiments?
Well, we have pretty low expectations, and what I mean by that is we just put the data out there, and sometimes what we get back is amazing, and sometimes not much comes back. And it started actually in DC with the Apps for Democracy contest under Vivek Kundra, and sort of opening up all of our data under Adrian Fenty, and then basically our administration in Chicago has done the same thing with John Tolva and just opened everything up, all the data sets. And people have put together, apps to figure out how people can collaborate to plow streets together, or more like shovel sidewalks. People take our Bikeshare data and do all kinds of interesting things with it. And I get tweets and questions about, what does this mean? And well, yeah, you hit 6 rides per day on Saturday, so you were the busiest in the world, but only for 2 hours. And people are really, into it and watching it. And I think it also stimulates new businesses. People look at all the data and they figure out, there seems to be a gap in either what the government's providing or what options are out there based on what the data says. And so I'm going to start this new company doing X. And our mayor is very progressive, forward-thinking, and believes in healthy competition, and sort of let the chips fall where they may for the most part.
Okay, great, thank you.
And I'd say to the question of what is preventing us from sharing more, I think all over the world there are laws that were written for an entirely different model. They were written for a centralized model that were regulated to keep us safe. And now we have models that are decentralized, that are platforms that allow people, entrepreneurs, to run micro businesses. In the case of Airbnb, for example, there's a platform, people are renting out homes and rooms, but that's not really regulated, or that's not able. Cities aren't yet able to regulate that, and so that's one of the really important questions here. It's from a very big structural perspective down to payment processing. Are questions. There are laws on the books that say you can't exchange vegetables that are grown in your own yard with a neighbor. There are health and safety codes. So it literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of laws around the world that are set up to prevent, or not set up to prevent sharing, but in fact that's what they're doing. And so I think that is one of the big questions we have: is how do we move forward to regulation?
Gabe's going to burp.
2.0.
Just to layer on top of that, plus you have old business models, even business models that the government's involved in, like we were talking outside. You have the taxi cab model, and taxi cab medallions are worth $350,000. So that's like an $18 billion industry in Chicago. And are these TNCs, a real-time ride-sharing companies, going to devalue that? And so there's all the old antiquated laws. There's sort of like what rules apply. There's the uncomfortability, if that's probably not a word.
It's actually absolutely not a word.
Okay, all right.
Even the guy who speaks French.
Yeah, he was like, that's not a word. But government can be very uncomfortable with the rate of change that's happening too. And so it makes it sort of this topsy-turvy, but also very exciting sort of new frontier time.
Is there any chance for the kids don't try this at home space with governments where, we can have permits that let us screw around and experiment without it actually having to scale? Because the whole idea of, as an entrepreneur, the whole idea of having to make the first thing that you do work would actually prohibit any new startup from getting started. And so, we there's a currency in failing in the startup community. And, I think that there's real reasons why you don't want, commercial airlines to do experiments and things like that. But certainly there's a kind of nascent space, at least in my movie version in my head, there should be a nascent space for sort of these sorts of permits. And I'm curious if any of you have had experience as you've rolled out new businesses or from within the city, have some sense of what do you think about that? Rick, do you have?
Well, you know, I was going to say that, I mean, putting it into the context of the sharing economy, the sharing economy isn't new. What's new about it is that it is now challenging the status quo in a very widespread way. It is occurring because it's filling market gaps. It's occurring because there are these historical and institutionalized regulations that effectively will stop innovation if somebody doesn't push through it. So it doesn't mean that all innovation is great, and I would suggest that there's a lot of it that's happening in the sharing economy now that's not innovative. It's just technology-enabled processes that people look at as new. That is what's really, I think, challenging some of what is in place in cities. So if we're ever going to be able to scale that idea of an eco-structure, it cannot happen without pushing through some of those regulations, without getting people like Gabe and like Ed Reskin, who spoke earlier, who get it, but have huge infrastructure and quite frankly, special interests who are going to constantly push against this. Yeah. There's one other point I want to make about this, and that goes back to my comment earlier on capital. We are at a point right now where in order to start many of these businesses, you need to have private investors, venture capitalists, or deep-pocketed companies, most of them public. Back to this issue of sharing data and information, they can't do that. They can't do something that wouldn't be in their shareholders' interests. So the only way we're going to get to that sharing of information is for people to, especially at the government level, to require it, to require the data, to acquire information if you want to play. If you want to have access to the public right away, if you want to have access to putting your vehicles into a building, you need to be able to share the information, and that's the only way it's going to happen.
Well, and I would say, I would just add to that, I think there's a two-way sharing also, right? Because, like, for example, how many people in the room have ever used Google? Good. I'm in the right place. So, the business model for Google is if we search for something a year ago, the results that we would have gotten a year ago and the results we would get today are totally different, and today's results are going to be better. And the reason is that all of us have been using it like fiends for the last year, plus everybody else on the planet. That it's a good example of the more sharing, the better the model gets, the better the results get, the better the benefit gets. The only issue is that the data is effectively going towards making a product better, but if you're not a shareholder of Google, you don't benefit financially, but you benefit as a customer. And I think that, a lot of the companies that I've been, friendly fighting with over the last 4 years, some very big multinational companies in very old spaces, who all are in regulated industries, finance and energy and transportation, et cetera, are all basically, not all, but many are trying to figure out where there's this safe space to not completely screw up their existing business model, but still play enough and understand enough about what's happening. And in exchange, the sort of currency for entering into that dialogue has been data. So I think that it's quite interesting to see the thing evolving. I know, excuse me, Gabe, that you want to say something over there about data and experiments. But I think that this might also be a good chance, after I let you speak, this might be a good chance also, if anybody has questions in the audience, it would be a great time to start to introduce questions.
Well, on the data thing, we've tried to require any new service that we offer to be open data. Even our recycling machines, the big bellies, they actually spew out data. Bikeshare, it's all public. And I think you can require that. And the bottom line, too, is everything's foilable. So there's making it really easy, just sort of streaming the data via an API. And then there's, all the data belongs to the public, basically, ultimately. But on the subject of trying things, I think in D.C., everything we did was a pilot, just about. Every single thing that we did. First bike lane, I mean, really, Dan Tangerlini's first try at the streetcar in Southeast DC was really a pilot. And in, that first bike share system that Dan and Adrian launched, yeah, it was sort of a flop in some ways, but it was a necessary flop. Just like in the private sector, it's important to fail to learn. It also acclimated people to the idea of what bike sharing was and allowed me to launch a whole system in 13 months, which I don't know if I could have done it that quickly if we hadn't had that sort of quote-unquote failure. And so pilots are a great way for people like me to get around that cultural issue of like, you're changing our street, or you're doing this, or you're doing that, and say, look, you don't like it, we'll take it out in a year. And they really are pilots, because like our first protected bike lane in Chicago, we put in 30 days. We may be pulling it out, actually, because we've learned so much since then. We may be moving it a street over.
Okay, great. Anyone with a question at this point? Okay, cool. So we'll keep going. Please don't be... Oh, yes, you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment, actually, related to innovation and...
Sure.
Oh, okay. Can I stand up? Okay, I'll stand up. So I just wanted to kind of make a comment on the conversation related to innovation and how you, and failing and trying things out. And I think that's actually where the role of the nonprofit can be really, really valuable. Mm-hmm. That when we started CarSharing in Chicago as a nonprofit, and we had a pilot project, and we had really no idea what was going to happen. And we kind of had the space to do that. And I know I've talked to people in the private sector who said, if you had started in the private sector, you would have been under pressure to grow really fast. There would have been a lot of capital in there, and and when I talk to folks who, in fact, in some of the sharing economy, people who've, they've got to go to many cities all at once, and they kind of don't have the time to, to hone in the model. So I think it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Great point. Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think that we should loop that into our conversation in that, is there a role in the ecosystem through a life cycle? For example, do nonprofits or peer-to-peer organizations that are fast to learn and have low expectations from an investor perspective, perhaps could have all different ways to create enough capital to get started, sort of the sourdough starter for a city, and get something going, and then later, are they expected to scale as that, or do other companies come in and take it over? What do you see, or what do you guys expect to happen? And also, if you have a bias about what you think will actually work, that would be great to hear as well.
But definitively, a community-based program, it's a good way of trying stuff and doing pilots and getting that culture around that new thing happening. That's depend of the market. In some other instance, instead of having like a community-based program, it can be an enclosed program in a very secure environment, and like a microclimate to definitively try something at a lower scale, and then run the number to see if you replicate it at a larger number if you have the same result. So there's different way of looking at it. Definitively, a peer-to-peer or a community-based program, a non-for-profit program, is definitively a great way of trying stuff. But there's also other way, also like microclimate or enclosed environment to trying different program.
Okay, great. Do you have something, Natalie? You have a face.
Well, no, sometimes I just feel like living in San Francisco, we are a sandbox where there are all kinds of things being tried. And I think city officials just have to look the other way in many cases. And one of the things I think on the regulation front that is important was a couple of weeks ago when the state of California set a new set of regulations for internet-based peer ride-sharing companies. And so they didn't take a new business model and stuff it into regulations for the old one. They basically set up an entirely new regulatory framework for some of these new companies to do this. And the regulations will evolve as the companies' business models start to evolve. So I think it's
so that brings up the question of, are we sort of in this lexicon problem, in that the regulations and the policies were set up for, I mean, my sort of way of talking about it is ownership versus access, and that when you look at the financial structures, and including insurance, everything goes wonky when you start to introduce this whole, shared access aspect. Gabe?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add on to what you're saying and respond to that. I think that the business models are sort of evolving and changing. Like when you look at Bikeshare, I started Bikeshare with 80% federal money in DC and Chicago. Jeanette used 100% private money. You have systems in Aspen and other places that are nonprofits. Sharon had a nonprofit CarShare that is now a for-profit CarShare. Tom's donates 10% or a pair of shoes for every pair of shoes they sell. I just feel like it's not as important anymore what the structure is. It's more about like the quality of the service. Are you serving the consumer well? I mean, you could have a private benefit corporation or an LLC. I don't know. I don't know if the customer really cares so much anymore.
You mean the container, but you're saying the business model has tremendous flexibility and people are being quite creative.
Yeah, I mean, like our Bikeshare system is run by, well, it's a government program owned by the city,
okay,
run by a private company with profit sharing for the city and the company. I mean, I don't know what you call that. I mean,
so
it's a public-private partnership.
Does the city benefit if there's a profit?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And the operator doesn't make any money unless there's a
And
profit.
how does your bike share? Like, what do you have to say about that model?
I would agree with Gabe. It's all over the place. We have all type of different business models. Depend of the market, depend of the size of the system, and sometimes it's publicly funded, sometimes it's a privately funded or
Has
sponsored.
any of this ever been articulated by someone like Dr. Shaheen or any of you guys who, because for example, like, I'm just a goofball who decides we should have bike sharing in Napa and we don't have sufficient density. It would be great to have the decoder ring, from people who already went before me of, here's the 5 flavors of funding to get started, and this is on the size and the density. We recommend you start with this as opposed to...
It's badly needed. I mean, I had like Los Angeles...
It's badly needed, Dr. Shaheen.
Yeah, it is. I mean, small cities...
She's a PhD. She's not, as my mother would say, she's not the kind of doctor who helps people. What? Oh, okay. Well, there you go. All right. Thank you. She has an answer for everything. So yes. So I think that those kinds of things are quite beneficial. How do I get you guys to fight with each other, though?
I didn't bring my boxing gloves.
And Rick, with your perspective from the Car Sharing Association, what do you see around car sharing and the various business models with respect to scale? Does it seem to start at with some nonprofit model and then there's more competition, or how does it seem to go?
The Car Sharing Association is a international association, yes. And so the different car sharing organizations that are members range from co-ops to for-profits to not-for-profits. They have one thing in common, though, and that they all adhere to a industry code of ethics and standards of practice. Many organizations are not members of that. And my question always is not why should you sign it, but why shouldn't you sign something that establishes an ethical base for using the public right-of-way? So we think that that's very important. But it's also, the standards of practice is a guide to the sharing economy in many ways. If there's not a purpose for what we're doing here, whether it's Lyft and sidecar, helping to find a new way for people to get around cities when there's a market gap, and quite frankly, dealing with the equity issues of helping people find jobs, okay? Or whether it's Enterprise, which has purchased 2 nonprofit organizations, when one could say that, if you want to be pessimistic, you could say that they're jumping on and taking over a public good organization. If you want to be optimistic, you could say they are now providing an opportunity to scale in those cities that they operate in. So there's a lot of, I guess the best way to put it is one size doesn't fit all, but we have to, from our point of view, I'll say this for the Car Sharing Association as well, we have to remember that what we're trying to do is make is allow and enable local communities to reach their, what we call environmental and social objectives. So if you're trying to reduce CO2 emissions, if you're trying to reclaim land from parking, if you're trying to increase the health through bike sharing or encouraging walking, that should be the purpose of all of, not just the sharing aspects of it, but the transit aspects of it too.
Does anyone, I mean, I'll ask the panel and anyone in the room, does anybody have a point of view backed ideally by facts? But otherwise, if you say it in a way that it sounds like a fact, well, we might all believe you.
Yes.
You, I'm not so sure. But.
I know. Well, sorry, I've been talking a lot.
I was just going to say, the question is, so there's a factual statement that's been made about, in San Francisco, there's basically, so Google's in Mountain View, which is, in the best instance, maybe 50 minutes from San Francisco if the wind's at your back and everyone's asleep. But it could take, an hour and a half, and on a really crappy day, it could take 2 hours to get there. And so Google, who had their headquarters in San Francisco, decided that they would create sex appeal around this idea of a really cool bus that had Wi-Fi that came basically to your neighborhood, picked you up, and whisked you to and fro. And so it's this very pleasant experience here known as the Google Bus experience. When you overlaid on something like Zillow, or you looked at a city map, and you looked at the neighborhoods where there was a Google bus stop, the value of the homes near the Google bus stop compared to a similar home in a different neighborhood but similar proximity, but not with a Google bus stop, was distinctly different. And the closer you were to the Google bus stop, the more value the house had, within reason. So, and I was, we all hear livability and walkability and this whole movement to the urban ideal environment. Wouldn't you think, and hopefully someone knows, that if there are actually, ride-sharing kind of intersections or, bike stations or places where there's car-sharing parking or these sorts of things, that it elevates the city, elevates that particular block or neighborhood from the perspective of actually having value. And do you see that as sort of anecdotally, or do you have any data about that?
I don't have data about that fact, but anecdotally.
But you can say, what do you want to say? Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
In Montreal, since the introduction of the bike-sharing system, people in their ad to rent apartment mention clearly, it's an highlight of the ad, that it's next to a big C station. We see that in the resale of houses and in the rental of apartment. It's very important.
So it's a feature of the house.
It's a feature of the house or the apartment.
Great.
Yeah. I mean, it's well documented. Transit-oriented development, whether it's around a multimodal hub that's public-private, or a streetcar stop, or a bus rapid transit stop, which is not quite as well documented yet, but it's becoming more documented. The values can be significantly higher for real estate. And if you look at like the streetcars when they first came about a century ago, the developers would build the streetcar line out to the neighborhood, then build the neighborhood around it. And that's essentially sort of what Google's doing. I mean, I would argue that we'd be much better off if they just stayed in San Francisco, and I'm sure they have a great reason for wanting to. But
you
all
can
these
have that conversation at lunch.
Well, all these tech companies, I find it fascinating. Apple, like they build these huge sprawling suburban campuses and then bus everybody out there, and I think it skews their view a little bit on transportation. That's just my 2 cents.
I also think that's shifting. Even that is shifting.
Well, and not only are neighborhoods where transit-oriented development happening are more valuable, I think cities where there's a full transportation diet are more the kinds of places that you see millennials wanting to live. Where, we in my family made a choice 4 or 5 years ago to get rid of our car. But it requires us to be able to take bike share when we need, to take a scoot when we need, to use city car share when we're going to Trader Joe's, and to, be able to have an entire diet of ways we can get around. So there has to be a really vibrant ecosystem for people to truly live in cities, without cars.
So, and you're making the argument that more choice is better.
Oh,
I would make that argument.
Absolutely. So.
I just can't get them to fight with each other. Yes.
More choice is better for people who choose it.
Sorry?
More choice is better for people who choose it.
Okay, that's your, what do you mean by that?
I mean, that's what she's saying, right, is that she's drawn to the place where she has choices because that enables another choice that she wants to make. A lot of the country doesn't choose that. Right? So for people who are in cities, people who come back to cities, this is great. But can I ask you guys a question about the sharing economy?
Yes,
Right,
that's why
so
we're
this
here.
shared stuff, what I see is that there's technology and there's a sort of a new mindset and there's starting to be changing regulation that allows me to rent things in smaller and smaller time increments with less and less transaction cost. Okay? So I'm doing the same thing that I used to do. I'm renting a car, but instead of renting it for 24 hours, I'm renting it for an hour and a half, right? Or I'm not really renting my bike share because I paid my annual fee and I just get to use it, but I guess that's a kind of a rent, but if I want to use it longer, I use it for longer. How is that a new economy? Right? What is the sharing economy? Except for in the peer-to-peer sharing case, you can sort of see how that's a different kind of economy, except for that a little bit, it's like the barter economy, so it's kind of the old economy, except for instead of bartering, you know, where I could trade, well, apparently not the vegetables that I grew for, you know, for the goat or whatever it is. I can only trade a goat for a goat, maybe. So I guess if you guys could sort of get into the question of how this changes the economy rather than how it changes how I get around the city, I'd be very interested to hear.
Well, there was a book written 3 or 4 years ago called The Mesh.
I was going to say, actually, for the sake of the people who are on the panel, and I don't know how much time we have left, but it's a great question. I'm actually having a conversation with you, hopefully, if you're there at lunch, to address the broader sharing economy conversation. But I would like each of them to answer your question. But I'm just letting you know that that's a great question, and Susan anticipated that, so we're going to have that conversation at lunch. Yes.
Well, it drastically changes the economics and experience of living in a city. And cities have been dying for a long time. And when you look at, if you decouple the cost of transportation and home ownership or renting an apartment, you know, particularly for disadvantaged people like in DC, we found that sometimes people are spending up to 53% of their income on transportation. And so between the cultural change and the actual, you know, options out there, it can mean that people don't have to leave the city when prices go up. It can mean that real estate can actually appreciate much more because now people can afford a $300,000 or $400,000 home because they don't have $1,000 car payment, insurance, depreciation, parking space, and so on. So I think from that standpoint, it's a complete game changer. But you're also right. It's lowering the cost of people dramatically, and it's taking an asset that was what I call a lazy asset that was sitting 92% of the time empty, and it's allowing them to buy in different ways. And that's really what technology is doing on a lot of fronts.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You're taking what was a very centralized model and decentralizing it across sectors, across transportation and food and homes. I think there's 2 trends I'm excited about. One is the sharing economy, so taking assets we own and opening it up for people to share, either with money or without. And the new technology that allows people to connect peer-to-peer in all kinds of new ways. I think of even like Skillshare, where people are coming together to teach coding or other skills that they have with one another. So matching people up. What used to be just you and your social network and maybe 1 degree beyond can now transcend geography, can transcend social networks, and connect people who have things with people who need things. And I think that's incredibly disruptive.
It's one thing I would just say is that there's something that we might take for granted that we call sort of legibility, the ability to actually see when something is available. And a lot of what is happening is suddenly we're able to see, like, you know, the building that didn't have a restaurant sign that had a restaurant in it, but nobody except people in the know knew that there was a restaurant there. When you put a sign there, suddenly the traffic increases or the different kind of customers, etc. This whole idea of data and the ability to actually create kind of a legibility of cities in new ways, and to make things that are wasted or sitting unused obvious to other people who may want to tap into them. May seem trivial, but it actually is converting a huge amount, especially when you take into the equation climate change issues and population density. It's really creating a very different dynamic around the way that marketplaces form and around how assets emerge. And the business model itself in terms of inventory is changing dramatically, which we'll talk about a little bit at lunch as well. Rick?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I agree. There's nothing. The sharing economy is not new. What's new is how disruptive and how it's challenging the status quo now through enabling factors. To get down to, I think, what was one of your points, what does this mean about the economy? Well, let me give you some very tactical examples of it. In San Francisco, if you're building a new building, it costs between $30,000 and $40,000 per parking space. That's how much it costs to build that. So if now, as you heard Supervisor Wiener talk about this earlier today, if we have a regulation that says you must have shared spaces, and we put a couple of shared cars in that space, all of a sudden, you don't have to have one-for-one parking. You can have half a space, say, per unit in that building, because people have access to their cars. You also have unbundled parking now, which means you can price that condo at a lower amount because you don't have to buy that $30,000 or $40,000 space. That's part of the sharing economy, and that is being enabled by both regulation, but also the advent of things like car sharing. Well, I said I'd give several examples, but I think that one stands on its own.
Yeah, the sharing economy brings two aspects. First, it's maximize the use of assets, and we have no choice. City getting denser and denser, and we won't have place to put all that stuff. So maximizing the use of every asset is critical. And second thing, it's give access to people that wouldn't be able to afford these assets otherwise. It's not everybody who can buy a car, but to use it when you need it, it's make more sense than to get back to Gabe's point, that help people getting back to cities and use services and assets that they need.
Lovely, thank you so much. I think we have another question.
Yes, good morning. My name is Amy Conrick. I'm from the Community Transportation Association in D.C. Also have worked a lot on job links and on issues for low-income people and connecting them, finding transportation for them to their jobs. So I was wondering, I wanted to ask your panelists, we talked a lot about integrating different types of transportation systems, like there was that beautiful slide that had the bike share and the taxi and everything. It was a gorgeous slide. So what if we thought more about integrating across sectors as well? And we've talked a little bit about that, but what if there were a bike share or a car share that was integrated with a public housing program? Or what if there was, like, I used Airbnb for an apartment this year in Paris, had a great time. What if there had been a bike share membership that came along with the rental of that Airbnb apartment? So what if we thought more about integrating across sectors, like we're starting to do a really good job across transportation sectors?
Wow.
Thank you very much. That's a great question.
Can I answer that real quickly? First of all, from your lips to policymakers' ears, I think that is really an important concept. We need, though, to have policy that is going to support some of the sharing economy, new businesses, in order to create both private, public and private partnerships, but also to get sharing economy companies to work together toward the same goals. One of the key things that you're mentioning also is this issue of equity. And it's one of the places where I think the sharing economy and, quite frankly, shared mobility is not working well. It has not gotten as deep into low and middle income areas. It is leaving underserved areas underserved, continuing to do that. And quite frankly, there are different communities who cannot and don't have access to the technology that is really driving a lot of the sharing economy. And that aspect really hasn't been talked about here today.
And I think that to that point, I just came from an urban adaptive metropolis conference last week also in Berkeley, and a whole group of people from around the world looking at urban manufacturing. And a big topic there, in both instances, this came up, which is that essentially it's sharing for rich people right now, right? Or my sort of slang way of talking about it, and that some of that is driven by the fact that a lot of the companies that have high profile are VC funded. But another reason, I think, is that the apps are driving a lot of the activity. And so the entry ticket to the game minimally is a smartphone and a credit card. And I think that we're starting to see a push towards more kind of diverse systems that include things like text-based. Like in Paris, you can, via text, request a taxi and organize all sorts of other things. From a transit perspective, I think we're seeing a trend in various cities, Copenhagen and London as well, where they're pushing for text-based services. So I think your comment is well taken, and at least the early indicators that I have is there are people who are, now that the models have been tested and are somewhat paid for, or they can make the math work, perhaps the profits will be used to be able to cast a wider net. Alain, do you have something?
No, we need a true leader that are visionary and will bring those policy up, but it's coming from the base. Like you said, the most of the sharing component right now are in the dense and more expensive area, and to bring it to the outside community, it needs to come from the base, needs to come from the population through those leaders that will change or implement those policies. Because it's not private companies or venture capital that will do it on their own if they're not forced to do it.
Totally.
Unfortunately.
I just have a question, and there's a gentleman in the back who has a question as well. Well, quick question is, how many of you in the room have know more than 5 people here before you started today? Okay. One of the things, I don't have an answer, but one of the things that's challenging, I think, is that this is a great forum to meet all sorts of characters. We're hanging out for a couple of days, and at the end of those days, we'll return to our lives and be busy, best intentions aside. And so I'm just curious if we can, I'll just say the sentence, I don't have a solution, but some way of kind of mapping, who's doing which sorts of experiences and experiments in different parts of the world so that we actually even know who to reach out to learn from. I think increasingly, what's accelerating is the number of experiments and presumably the lessons learned. But it's very hard for us to actually even know who to talk to. Sir, I think you're, okay. We have one here first, and then we'll take you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vijay Kinitakar with Colorful Flags. I know you guys just touched upon equity, so thank you. That was actually part of my question. But outside of policy and regulations, I wanted to ask a little bit about adoption, more specifically in regards to diverse ethnic communities and low-income communities. What kind of steps or challenges have we seen in kind of permeating those communities? Because with sharing economy at the heart of it, it's all about community trust at the end of the day. So how are we going about targeting different ethnic groups who a lot of times come from a culture of community sharing and might be primed for adopting the sharing economy, and how do we get into that and get through into those communities?
Great, thank you. Great question.
Well, let me talk a little bit about CarSharing. You have a fantastic organization in Buffalo, New York, and you should talk. They're going to be speaking tomorrow, but who has very specifically gone after ethnic communities, low and moderate income communities. In San Francisco, we have a program that's all self-funded. We get no money from anybody else to do this, called Community Share, which specifically tries to bring people into car sharing. We have an affordable housing program. We have Access Mobiles, which are wheelchair accessible vehicles in car sharing. Those are the way we look at innovation, and they are all directed at bringing new stakeholders into the process. IGO in Chicago, which is now Enterprise, did a fantastic job of getting into new neighborhoods. And I want to make one other point. They did it without the expectation they were going to make money in the short term. This is a marathon. It takes a long time, at least as far as car sharing is concerned, to make money in those neighborhoods. But they did it not just because they were a nonprofit, because for-profits can do it too. They did it because of what the community needed, because they were trying to help the community reach its objectives.
And I guess I'll just agree with that and then push back a little bit on some of what I've heard, because I think there's this assumption by certain people that disadvantaged people, poor people in urban areas don't have access to technology. I mean, mobile's changed all of that. When I was with Zipcar and we did the deal with Metro, and this was the right thing for them to do, they said, you have to put cars everywhere at all the stations. You have to put them in Southeast DC. So my CEO, question is like, I don't know, that's going to be a real doozy. I mean, we're going to lose a lot of money on those cars. I said, I don't think so. We put the cars in, and they were #1 in the entire fleet within probably 2 months. Now then with Bikeshare, there's been some cultural barriers. Not everybody views the bike the same way. In the 90s when I opened a bike store in a Cuban neighborhood in Miami, people didn't take to it because they viewed riding a bike, they equated it with being on welfare. So I mean, I think it's a very complicated mix, but I think for-profit or non-profit, they can be required, particularly in partnerships with the government. Sure, if you want the space, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and I think that's an important part of that equation.
Yeah. There's two other comments to the question you made, which is, like a place like San Francisco, bike sharing is kind of almost a year-round activity. In Buffalo, New York, having been there, I'm guessing it's not, unless you have snow tires. But I think, so weather plays a role also, I think, in terms of access. And the other part is the aging population is a really important factor in all of this. I know that in Copenhagen, they have a clean tech cluster, and they're in the process of putting together an elder cluster, starting to look at, how do they need to facilitate everything from mobility to food, but basically policies and design, addressing policy and design issues with an aging population. And I would just also put that on the table for the next couple of days as one of the things that should be addressed from Japan, Western Europe, and North America. I think the last statistic I saw in the U.S. is 15,000 people a day are turning 65 in the U.S., and that trend will continue for at least 15 years. So it's a big deal.
The other thing I'd add is just getting back to the earlier conversation about the infrastructure. I've been really inspired by TUML and a set of other accelerators and incubators with this in mind, to find entrepreneurs who want to figure out the future of the sharing economy that is truly has equity at its heart. And can support entrepreneurs who want to do that. And that gets to having angel investors and capital that can support that kind of thing. The other thing that I think is important here is a lot of these experiences are marketplaces. And many people who are participating on the supply side are people who are struggling to find a job. My Lyft driver on the way over here, he heard me on the phone chatting about this, and he said, listen, I am going back to school because of Lyft, because I'm able to drive, because I'm able to have this job. I'm able to go back to veterinary school in the fall. And he's of a generation that's screwed. Like, this generation is graduating into the worst job market that this country's seen in decades. And so they're having to figure out, a lot of these questions. And I think the sharing economy is in part coming out of that.
Sorry, I was just going to say TUML, T-U-M-M-L, is a San Francisco-based urban accelerator that focuses on looking at problems in the city and bringing in entrepreneurs who want to address those problems. A quick comment from you, and then I want to take this.
So bike sharing is really a community program, and I can give you an example from all over the world. We need to engage the community. I will give you just a quick example. In Montreal, when we launched the bike sharing program, we team up with a school around Montreal, and we help a kid who drop out from school, who were at the verge of dropping out, and signed a contract. Like, it's not an official contract because they were minor, but we said, hey, you finish high school, and we'll give you a trade job, and you will be able to become Dr. Bixie and fix those bicycles. So it was very important to get the community on board with the program. And we saw that everywhere around the world. Bike sharing is really a community-based program.
I like Dr. Bixie.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yes, sir. You've been very patient.
No problem. My name is Peter. I just have a question probably for the policymakers. Like, we've heard a lot about what is the kind of economic viability of some of these sharing programs, especially where the city is sponsoring them because they realize that they're kind of cornerstones for either congestion or sustainability or air quality or whatever goal they're trying to achieve. I don't know that there's a transit system in the world that makes money. When did that become the criteria? I mean, we pour an enormous amount of money into rail bus, have been subsidizing it for a very long time depending on the city. I've been sharing a bus and a train car since I was a little kid in the Bronx, in an economically depressed area, by the way, getting to everywhere I needed to go. What is the policy shift where this stuff has to start kind of paying out for itself, even though it's something that the city sees as absolutely critical for the vitality and the economic development of the region?
So one clarification of your question. Thank you very much for the question. Are you asking what's, when you said this, do you mean any of these shared use platforms, or are you specifically referring to car sharing and bike sharing?
I'm specifically referring to the shared use platforms where the city is kind of the owner of the program and deploying it as part of its intermodal or transportation strategy.
Okay, thank you.
I'd love to answer
You
that.
have to answer that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's really a couple answers. One is we're broke. The country's $17 trillion in debt. In terms of state of good repair, hundreds of billions of dollars behind, if not trillions. I forget the exact figure, investing in our transit systems that are crumbling and falling apart. And it's the same reason why we can't continue to invest in automobile infrastructure at the same rate that we used to. And so we have to have these low-cost, high-return ways for people to get around, which, by the way, are better for them anyway, not than transit. I mean, transit is very important, and we're going to have to subsidize transit. But if you look at like the bike share system in Chicago, the tourists that use it on the weekends actually subsidize the people who use it on the weekdays, which are the residents. And that's how we can afford to charge 20 cents a day to residents to use it. And when we launched Capital Bike Share in DC, I think I see Adrian Fenty there peeking around the corner at me. My mayor, Adrian, said, you know, can it be the biggest in the country? Yeah. You know, can it be the best? And can it make money? And it wasn't about making money, it was about not creating another deficit. And I think that's something that we have to look at as a country. And you see what's going on in DC, the government is shut down because of it. So
it's not profitability, but it's sustainability? Is that your...
It's got to be able to sustain itself. And to the point where, like for instance, bike share systems need to be reinvested and reinvigorated every 5 years. So when we designed our system, we thought, okay, how are we going to pay for, you know, to re-up the entire system in 5 years? They didn't think about that when they built the highway system in 1955. They didn't think about it when they built the CTA. And now we're dealing with it, and we've got a $10 billion problem just on the CTA. So, you know, it's sort of easy to forget about the dollars and cents, but at the end of the day, if we don't start thinking about it, we're going to be in real trouble.
Would then you consider privatizing the other modes that you have in place?
I mean, I'm not going to speak for Chicago because I'm not trying to make news here, but I think you will absolutely see that happening. Absolutely. You know, smart investments. Like we privatized in Chicago the Skyline, which was actually a good thing for Chicago to do. The Skyway, excuse me. Skyway, not the Skyline. But then they also privatized the parking meters.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, right. Which was a disaster. So, you know, you have to look at the return on investment. But I think forcing people to look at, is there a return here, is actually better because you will give people a better quality service in the end, I think. Whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit or whatever, as long as you're focusing on giving the best quality service to people and generating some sort of profit is usually a part of that. I think like Divvy Bike Share made $400,000 in its first month. And I think we rolled out a really kick-ass bike share system, and I think that's why it's making money. And at some point, we'll sell a sponsorship to it so we can reinvest in it and rebuild it in 5 years.
Are you suggesting government agencies should be profitable?
Yes. Actually, I am. I think that's one of the problems in government. I think every agency should have a P&L. And their shareholders are the public, and they should be working for the greater good first and foremost, and not everything's going to make money. but we don't utilize our assets in the smartest way possible and get as much out of them as we should. And that's actually the purpose of the sharing economy also. We can't continue to use our natural resources to build cars that are used 8% of the time. So we just have to be more efficient across the board.
I was just going to propose we have the first meeting of the Gabe Klein for mayor meeting outside.
No.
Is there anybody else here who could speak on behalf of another city with a different perspective to answer this, to make a comment about this question? Yes? Can someone give the gentleman now? Thank you.
So I'm with Buffalo CarShare, and we also have a bike share program that does operate, although not in the winter. We're not expecting to operate in the winter. Yeah, I just want to kind of address what I would say are kind of maybe misconceptions is a little bit too strong of a word, but we do things a little differently in Buffalo. I would say that shared use mobility is not something that is rejected by low-income individuals, low-income families, households. I would say that the government's not broke. It just doesn't spend its money very well. And we don't really have a scheme that says, the FTA spends this much on making low-income car sharing work in Buffalo, or FHWA spends this much. There's no allocation, but that doesn't mean that there's not government investment in growing our system, That doesn't mean that there's not nonprofit foundation investment in growing our system. So I think to suggest that the government's not going to invest, the government's not going to subsidize, is kind of maybe putting us a little bit too much in a box. And there's a whole host of programs out there, some of which don't directly speak to car sharing, shared mobility, which should, right? And that partly is just kind of being behind the curve, and that partly is attributable to what's going on in Washington and just, this sort of inability to get anything done and change the equation, change the conversation. But we're a very small city. We have a very small fleet of cars and bikes. But I think the writing is on the wall that there's going to be a way to get public support for a system that expands the limits of who uses it in a way that supports the public good.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Just a comment also to make the data conversation more visible is transparency is also driving some of this, and people who live in places and pay taxes in places are getting increasingly aware of what money is available and where it's being spent and how it's being spent. And I think that increased the need for trust and increased transparency between communities and the government is also driving a lot of this necessity to kind of, as my fourth grade teacher would say, show your math. The second comment is that this is not U.S. or North America thing. This is a global thing. And we see cities, from Singapore and Sao Paulo and small cities like Curitiba in Brazil and, all through Europe, certainly, and even in Africa, places who are basically implementing a lot of these shared use platforms. I think that, in general, the business model is a fundamental question when they go in, and probably it is because of the issue of the misalignment between urban density and the financial situation of most cities. So, the public-private partnerships have been backing a lot of the bike sharing, certainly, and streetcars and other things. Other questions? Sorry. Oh, hi.
Thank you, Jean Grabert from France. Yes, just an additional comment to what you said, and I previously thought about that. It's about, finally, the path to reach the success, as we saw on a slide. And if we have a worldwide vision about that, we can see that, obviously, we have car-free days in Indonesia. We can notice that the modal share of bikes is rising again in China. And so we have different paths and different conditions. In US, you build cities by cars and for cars. In Europe, we are much more public transport oriented. And in emerging country, the question of informal sector is very important, bringing low-tech solutions, which are very interesting. And you spoke about, so for mobility, the paths are very different, but I think it is converging, and it's very interesting to see the common features and the specific aspects of these different areas within the world. But quite frankly, it seems to converge, which is very interesting. And about share economy, there is a very interesting thing in US, I think. It's about communities. Communities are existing in US. They don't exist so much in Europe. But so the question of sharing things is really at stake. And for example, now in Europe, we have the huge market of second-hand things under development. So people sell things and they are recycled by the use. These were only additional ideas.
Thank you. Do you guys have any response to that? Yes.
Hi, I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on how the sharing economy growth will impact the structure of federal funding for transportation in the U.S., and perhaps there's other models from other countries as well.
Actually, well, I think we're talking about that tonight at 7. Well, not the sharing economy, but federal funding. But that's one of the problems, is that we're so light on federal funding and funding in general. The gas tax hasn't changed in 21 years. And it should have been pegged to CPI, but it wasn't. And so, like, just to clarify on the bike share thing, we use federal funding to start it.
Yeah.
So I'm not at all saying we shouldn't use government funding. I'm just saying that we have to look at making things sustainable on a lot of different levels. Sustainable economically is part of it. And I think on the funding front, that's why the private sector is becoming so important, because we don't have any additional funding at this point.
What I've seen in various places outside the U.S. and as well as here is that there's what I call sort of define, refine, and scale, and the funding that goes with defining or testing and refining a model or the idea, getting feedback from the community, and then figuring out how to scale. Each of those, potentially have different vehicles for funding. So just, I think that we're seeing hopefully more definition and refinement before scaling, because that makes the model much more sustainable, wastes a lot less money, and gives us other options for ways to fund the first 2 bits. Yes? I think we have one more question. Are we okay? Yes?
Am I on?
You could just have a booming voice.
Well, I'm from Kansas City, and we have our own set of challenges there. I'm part of the organization that owns and operates the bike share system there. Mm-hmm. And we have an issue with culture in Kansas City, because there is no shared use culture at all. Everybody's so proud of their wonderful highways.
I think it's working.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Well, there it goes. Everybody is so proud of their highways and their ability to get downtown in 15 minutes. It creates this sort of culture that everybody loves the idea of shared use, and everybody wants to pat you on the back for trying to bring it to Kansas City, but there's very, very few people who want to support you in the kind of ways that you need to actually make it happen. And so my question is, do you need to really fully change the culture to bring that in? Or is it such that you need to find some outside force to sort of flood the market with some type of shared use mobility so that, like you were talking about earlier, access trumps ownership?
Well, I have a strong opinion. My comment is just, I think, having been to Kansas City, one of the things that makes these things be a pull rather than a push is having a downtown that's happening, or where it's aspirational to be there. And one of the reasons I think that it's working so well, the programs in these various parts of the world, is that there are people who, A, really know that they want to be in the downtown areas where there's already a lot of traffic. So there's the draw plus the negative aspect of the traffic. In Kansas City, I think that there's a very different density piece. But what is happening in Kansas City, because of your mayor and a number of other things, is there's a lot of seeding of an entrepreneurial community and seeding with Brad Feld and some other, the Kauffman Foundation and other groups that are trying to bring the startup culture there, that with the idea of embracing makers and artists and entrepreneurs to make the downtown cool, that will pull, you know, the right community of people who then want to start to use some of these systems. But I think, like most products or services, you know, you need to target customer. We have a quick, no, we're out of time. I'm getting the hook.
Okay. So we have 45 minutes for lunch, and we really want to have time to hear Lisa speak. She's our lunch speaker for today, and we're going to be doing lunch not here as the program says, but actually down on the first floor in restaurant 750. And then we'll have more opportunities, Odile, to speak with Lisa and to the other panelists. But I'd like to thank you guys. It was a really great discussion.
Thank you.